The morning my daughter-in-law set a plate of bread in front of me that had blue-green mold on the underside of 3 of the 4 slices, I did not eat it. I did not say anything either. What I did was take out my phone, photograph each slice from above and below, note the date and time in the memo application, and place the phone face down on the table beside the plate. Then I looked at my daughter-in-law and said, "Thank you, Renee. I'm not very hungry this morning." She looked at the untouched bread. She looked at me. Then she looked away, because looking at me would have required seeing what she had done, and seeing what she had done would have required understanding what it meant. And she was not yet ready for either of those things. My name is Adele Rose Fontaine Beaumont. I am 67 years old, and I spent 31 years as a food safety and hygiene specialist for the State of Georgia Department of Public Health, during which time I inspected, assessed, documented, and closed restaurants, food processing facilities, institutional kitchens, and residential care homes across the northern half of the state. I wrote the food safety training curriculum that is currently used in all state-licensed care facilities. I have testified as an expert witness in 11 cases involving foodborne illness, 4 of which resulted in criminal charges. I know what mold looks like. I know exactly what it means to offer it to someone. The bread was not the first incident. It was the one I had been waiting for. Let me tell you the whole story, beginning with the move and ending with the officers at the door. 'Tis because the whole story is what is true, and the partial story is what Renee would prefer you to have. I moved into my son Gregory's house in Marietta, Georgia in January of this year, which was 6 months ago. The move was my idea and also not my idea, which is the specific ambiguity of decisions made under the accumulated pressure of a family that has decided something and is waiting for you to decide it too. My husband Bernard died in November. We had been married for 43 years. Bernard was a retired civil engineer who spent his retirement rebuilding a 1967 Mustang in our garage, and who was, by any measure I can apply, the best person I have known. Patient and funny and genuinely good in the way that some people are genuinely good, without effort or performance, simply as a matter of their character. He died of heart failure on a Tuesday morning. He was in the garage. The Mustang is still there, at my sister's house now, because I could not look at it. After Bernard died, Gregory began the pressure campaign with the specific gentleness of a son who loves his mother and is also managing his wife's preferences. Gregory is 41, and he is a good man who has spent 14 years learning to manage the specific competition between his instinct to be a good son and his wife's instinct to be the primary organizing principle of any household she inhabits. These are not always compatible instincts, and Gregory has been managing the incompatibility for 14 years with the patient unhappiness of someone who has decided that the incompatibility is simply the cost of the life he has chosen. Renee Hargrove Beaumont is 38 years old. She is a real estate agent in Marietta who is good at her work and who has the specific quality that good real estate agents have, the ability to present a version of a thing that emphasizes what the observer should want to see and carefully de-emphasizes what they should not. This skill transfers from real estate to domestic life with considerable success. The house in Marietta is presented warmly. The family is presented as functional. The relationships within it are presented as affectionate. The presentation is not entirely dishonest. There are genuine warm moments in the house. Gregory genuinely loves his children, a son named Marcus, who is 12, and a daughter named Lily, who is 9. And his genuine love for them produces genuine warmth in the house that coexists with the other qualities I have described. So what Renee had not anticipated when Gregory pressed the case for my moving in was that I was a different kind of person from what she had assessed. She had assessed me as an elderly widow who would be grateful for the company and whose gratitude would make her manageable. She had not assessed me as a food safety specialist with 31 years of government inspection experience and the specific professional habit of documentation that 31 years of inspection produces. I did not correct this assessment when I arrived. I allowed it to stand. I had been a professional observer for 31 years. Observation requires patience. I observed. What I observed over the first 6 months was a household organized around a specific hierarchy. Renee's comfort at the top, Gregory's preferences in the middle, and then the needs of everyone else, the children, the guests, and now me, arranged below according to how much inconvenience they caused. I did not cause much inconvenience, which meant I was placed very low in the hierarchy. This placement produced certain effects that I documented in the same memo application I used for professional notes as they occurred. I want to say something about Bernard before I proceed, because Bernard is part of the account even though Bernard is gone. We met in 1978 at a public health conference in Atlanta, where I was presenting preliminary findings from a food safety study I had conducted in Fulton County. And he sat in the front row and asked the best question anyone asked that day, a technical question about the relationship between pipe infrastructure degradation and the cross-contamination patterns I had documented. And at the coffee break, he came to introduce himself, and we talked for 45 minutes about infrastructure and public health and the specific gap between what the regulatory framework required and what it actually produced. He was the first person outside my professional world who had ever asked me a question that required me to think before answering. I married him in 1981. We were together for 43 years, and the 43 years contain things that belong to us and not to this account. What belongs to this account is simply the fact that when he died in November, I lost the person who had been the primary relationship of my adult life, and the grief of that loss was real and present in mine, and was not the same as incapacity, and was treated as incapacity by my son, who loved me and was frightened. Gregory called every day, then twice a day. He pressed the case. Augusta was far. The house was too large. Wasn't it better to be near family? The pressure was loving and genuine and also organized in part around his wife's preference for a version of this outcome that would resolve both my situation and hers. Renee had a specific need for the household to be organized around her management of it. A dependent, manageable mother-in-law solved certain problems for her. A dependent, manageable mother-in-law was what she had projected onto me. I want to tell you about the documentation before I tell you about the bread, because the documentation is what made the bread matter, and because the documentation reflects the specific way of thinking that 31 years of food safety inspection installs in a person. In food safety work, documentation is everything. Not because documentation creates the reality exists whether or not it is documented, but because documentation is what makes the reality actionable. A food safety violation that is observed and not documented is a violation that cannot be addressed through the regulatory and legal mechanisms that exist to address violations. Documentation is the bridge between what is real and what can be done about what is real. I have kept detailed notes my entire professional life. This is not a habit I turned on when I moved into Gregory's house. It is simply how I operate. When I began documenting what was happening in the household, I was not planning anything specific. I was simply recording what I observed in the way that I have always recorded what I observed, because the recording is the practice, and the practice is what I am. The first entry in my household notes was from the second week of January, 9 days after I arrived. Renee had served dinner for the family, grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, rice, and had given me a bowl of rice from a container that had been in the refrigerator for 7 days. I had seen the container when I put my leftovers from Tuesday away on Tuesday, and it was already there, and it was now the following Tuesday. I did not eat the rice. I noted the date and time and the specific observation, and I moved on. The second entry was from 10 days later. Renee had asked me, after she and Gregory and the children finished a meal of fresh pasta that she had prepared, to heat myself something from the fridge. The fridge contained the pasta in a container that was 1 day old, which would have been appropriate, a container of soup that was 11 days old, which would not have been appropriate, and a container whose contents I could not identify, and which had a notable odor when I opened the lid. I heated the fresh pasta, noted the contents of the refrigerator in the memo app with timestamps from the container labels I could read, and said nothing. The entries accumulated over 6 months. Not every day. There were many days of ordinary household life, of meals that were adequate and interactions that were neutral. But the pattern was consistent and documentable. I was offered inferior food at a rate and in a manner that was not consistent with the ordinary variation of a busy household. The inferior food was specifically inferior in ways related to food safety. Food that had been stored beyond safe holding times. Food that showed visible signs of spoilage. Food from containers that had been in the refrigerator far longer than the food safe shelf life. Over 6 months, I had documented 47 specific incidents. 47 instances of food offered to me that would have been citable violations if they had been offered in a commercial or institutional food service setting. Some were minor, food at the outer edge of safe holding time, which might be acceptable in a household context. Some were significant, food that was visibly spoiled, food that had been held in conditions that created genuine health risk. The bread was not the worst incident I had documented. It was the clearest, the most unambiguous, the most photographically evident. It was also the one I chose to act on. I want to add a note about what documentation meant to me in this context, because documentation in a domestic situation has a different quality than documentation in a professional one. When I documented a violation in a restaurant kitchen, the documentation was impersonal. The violation existed independent of my relationship to the establishment. When I documented what Renee was offering me, the documentation was personal in a way that professional documentation is not. because the person being harmed was me, and the relationship involved was my family. This produced a specific discomfort that I want to acknowledge. I was documenting my son's household. I was building a case against my daughter-in-law in the same methodical way I had built regulatory cases against commercial operators. The professional habit was the right tool for the situation. Using the right tool still felt like something I had to choose to do, rather than something that simply happened. I chose it. Every day I chose it. Because the alternative, absorbing the incidents without record, allowing the pattern to continue without consequence, was a choice too. And that choice would have been a choice to accept the statement being made about what I was worth. Before I describe what I did, I want to describe the household more fully, because the household is more than the documentation suggests, and the account is not complete without the fuller picture. Gregory is a good man, caught between two loyalties that he has not found a way to fully honor simultaneously. He loves me, and he loves Renee, and he has convinced himself, over 14 years, that loving both simultaneously is possible if he manages each relationship carefully enough. The management has been for most of those 14 years adequate in the specific sense that it has prevented open conflict. It has not been adequate in the deeper sense of actually resolving the underlying tension, which is the tension between Renee's need to be the organizing principle of her household and my existence as a person with my own needs and my own authority who has moved into her household. I want to be clear about something. I did not expect Renee to simply absorb my arrival without friction. Moving your mother-in-law into your house is a significant adjustment and produces genuine difficulty for the person whose space is being shared. I had made this adjustment as easy as possible in the practical sense. I paid my share of the household expenses. I did not require special attention. I managed my own schedule without imposing on theirs. I was, in every practical sense, a low-maintenance person. What I was not, and what I suspect Renee had not fully anticipated, was someone who noticed things, and she had expected a grateful widow who would be pleased to have company, and who would accommodate the household's preferences, because the accommodation was the price of the belonging. What she got was a retired government inspector who had spent 31 years noticing things that other people preferred not to notice, and who had the professional habit of recording what she noticed. The children had absorbed this. Marcus, who is 12, and has the specific perceptiveness of a preteen who watches adults with more attention than adults tend to assume, had figured out within 3 weeks that I was paying attention to things and had begun to ask me questions about what I was paying attention to. I had answered him honestly. He is a child I trust. Marcus and I had a particular morning ritual on weekdays before the household fully woke. We would sit at the kitchen table for 15 minutes, and he would tell me whatever was on his mind. He talked about school, his friendships, a history project, complicated social situations with other children. I listened and asked questions. In the 3rd week, he asked me whether I had noticed things about the household that I was not saying. I told him I had. He said, "Grammy, you know that thing you're always writing in your phone?" I said yes. He said, "I think that's probably important." I told him it probably was. He nodded and went to get his backpack. He is a good child who deserves to grow up in a household that is honest with itself. Lily is a 9 and is, in the specific way of 9-year-olds, equally perceptive and significantly less strategic. She knew something was wrong between her mother and her grandmother. I use the term loosely, since I am her step-grandmother, but she uses it freely, and she expressed this knowledge by being very kind to me, which is the specific way that children who sense adult tension respond when they are fundamentally good people. Gregory knew that the household was not what it appeared to be. He knew this in the way that people who are managing two versions of a situation always know that the management is not the same as the resolution. He was managing. He had been managing for 6 months. He did not ask questions, because asking questions would have required looking at the gap between the management and the resolution. And looking at that gap was the thing he had been most carefully avoiding. I had not told him about the documentation. I had not told him about the incidents. I had allowed the management to continue while I completed the documentation, because the documentation needed to be complete before it was useful, and because incomplete documentation is not documentation. It is complaint, and complaint requires a different kind of response than documentation. The bread completed the documentation. I should tell you about the dinner the night before the bread, because the dinner is part of the account, and because the specific contrast of the dinner and the breakfast is the most legible version of what was happening in this household. Renee had made steak for dinner. Not the whole family, she had told me when I came down to the kitchen at 6, that she and Gregory were having a date night at the kitchen table, and that the children were having sandwiches in the playroom, and that I should help myself to whatever. Whatever in this context was the contents of the refrigerator, which contained the bread that I would photograph the following morning. I made myself scrambled eggs, which is what I make when I need something adequate and do not want to negotiate with the refrigerator's contents. The scrambled eggs were fine, and I ate them at the kitchen counter because the kitchen table was occupied. I want to describe the specific quality of that moment, eating scrambled eggs at the counter while my daughter-in-law and my son ate steak at the table, because the description is part of what was true about those 6 months, and because the specific quality of that kind of moment is harder to document than the food safety violations, which at least have a regulatory language for what they are. What I was experiencing at the counter was not humiliation precisely. Humiliation requires that you accept the statement being made about you, and I did not accept it. I understood the statement. The table is for the people who matter. The counter is for you, and I documented it. And I continued eating my scrambled eggs without drama, because drama was not the appropriate response. The appropriate response was what I was doing. But I want to be honest. There is a quality to being assigned to the counter, while the people who invited you to live with them eat at the table that is difficult to name in the clinical language I prefer. It has a weight. It sits differently than the food safety incidents, which are concrete and documentable. The counter is not a food safety violation. It is simply the expression of a certain kind of regard, and the expression, sustained over 6 months, had its own accumulating effect. I noted this effect, too, in the memo application. Not in the food safety section, but in a separate section I had labeled simply Other Observations. The counter. And the occasions when Renee addressed me from across the room without looking at me. The way my contributions to household conversations were received, acknowledged briefly, and moved past. the way you acknowledge something that has been said by someone whose perspective is not fully in the room. Over 6 months, the food safety incidents were 47. The other observations were considerably more. From the kitchen counter, I could see the steaks. They were New York strips, approximately 12 ounces each, and they had been prepared with the specific care that Renee brought to things she cared about, seasoned correctly, rested after cooking, served on plates that had been warmed. A bottle of wine that I recognized as the kind that costs more than the weekly grocery budget I had been given for my personal food purchases. I watched this from the counter while I ate my scrambled eggs. I did not say anything. I noted the contrast in my memo application, not the emotional quality of the contrast, which is not what documentation is for, but the factual quality: date, time, what was served to whom, what was available to me. In the morning, Renee brought me the bread. She put the plate on the table in front of me with the specific cheerful efficiency she used for household tasks, a brightness of manner that communicated, "I am doing my share here. The fact that I am serving you breakfast is evidence of my contribution to this household. Please acknowledge it." The bread was on a white plate. The plate was clean. The bread looked from above like bread. "Don't waste it, Mom," she said. "Just eat the rest." She went back to the counter, hiked where she was making herself avocado toast with fresh sourdough from the bakery 3 streets over. I photographed the bread. I noted the date and time. I looked at the avocado toast. I said, "I'm not very hungry this morning, Renee." She did not look at me. "There's no point in throwing it out," she said. "It's perfectly fine." It was not perfectly fine. Aspergillus or Penicillium species, based on the color. Blue-green mold with the characteristic circular spread pattern. On bread, which has the water activity level and pH range that supports rapid internal mold growth. Visible surface mold indicates that the internal structure of the bread is almost certainly thoroughly contaminated. This is first-year food science. This is the information that is on the label of every commercial bread product sold in the United States. This is the information that a food safety specialist teaches in the first module of the state certification course for food handlers. Perfectly fine is what you say when you have not been paying attention to what food safety means, or when you have been paying attention to something else entirely. I did not call the police first. I want to be precise about the sequence, because the sequence matters for understanding both the legal outcome and my own thinking about what I was doing and why. The first call I made was to my attorney, not a family attorney. I have a personal attorney, a woman named Constance Wade, who has represented me on various matters for 12 years, and who has the specific quality of an attorney who understands that her job is to protect her client's interests by providing accurate legal information quickly and without unnecessary complication. I called Constance at 8:45 in the morning, while the bread was still on the table. I described the situation. 6 months of documented incidents, the specific incident this morning, my professional background, the nature of my documentation. And I asked her what my options were. She told me the documented pattern, combined with my professional expertise and the photographic evidence, was sufficient to support a report to Adult Protective Services under Georgia's elder abuse statutes. The statutes define elder abuse to include neglect, which includes the provision of inadequate care to an elderly person in a dependent living situation. She said she would look at the full documentation before giving a definitive opinion, but that, based on this summary, the case was viable. I also asked her about the food safety violation angle. She connected me, within the hour, to a colleague who practiced in administrative and regulatory law, who told me that if the incidents occurred in a commercial or institutional setting, they would constitute multiple citations under the Georgia Food Service rules. In a private household, the regulatory framework was different, but the documentation could support the APS report and potentially a criminal neglect charge. The second call I made was to the Georgia Division of Aging Services, which operates the Adult Protective Services hotline. I had called this hotline before in my professional capacity, when I had encountered evidence of elder abuse in institutional settings I was inspecting. The protocol was familiar to me. I gave them my name, my address, the name of the person in whose household I was living, and a summary of the documented incidents. I told them about my professional background. I told them that I had photographic and written documentation of 47 incidents over a 6-month period, culminating in an incident this morning in which I had been offered visibly moldy bread, while the other household members were served fresh food. The APS intake coordinator asked several clarifying questions. She was professional and thorough. At the end of the intake, she told me that a caseworker would contact me within 48 hours for an initial assessment. The caseworker contacted me the same afternoon. The third call I made was to Gregory. I called him at his office at 10:30. I told him what I had done and why. He was very quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Mom, I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "That's why I'm telling you now instead of after." "What happens next?" I told him. The APS caseworker was a woman named Danielle Okafor, who arrived at the house at 3:30 in the afternoon. She was 34 years old, professional and measured in the specific way of people who do a difficult job with genuine commitment to doing it correctly. She had reviewed my intake report and had the documentation I had provided. I had sent the full memo file with its 47 entries to Constance's office, and Constance had forwarded it to APS with a cover letter explaining my credentials. Renee did not know what was happening until Danielle arrived. Gregory had come home from the office at noon, which was unusual, and had been in the kitchen with me when I told him the full account, the documentation, the incidents, the pattern. And he had listened with the specific expression of a man who is understanding something. He had been managing not to understand for a long time. He had not tried to defend Renee. He had said, "How long?" I had told him 6 months. He had been very quiet. I want to describe the noon conversation more fully, because it was the most honest conversation Gregory and I had had in the 6 months I lived in his house. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and listened to the full account. I read from the memo application, 47 entries. Some of the entries he recognized as moments he had been present for. The ones he had been present for were harder, because being present for something and not seeing it is different from simply not knowing. When I finished, he said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I needed the documentation to be complete, and because complaints produce defenses. Documentation produces accountability." He was quiet for a long time. Then, what do you need? I need you to understand, I said, that the way you have been managing this household has not protected me. It has protected the version of the household that you preferred to believe exists. Those are different things. He looked at me with the expression I recognized from when he was young, and I had said something he knew was exactly right and did not want to be exactly right. Then he nodded. When Danielle arrived, Renee was home. The children were at school. I want to describe Renee's face when Danielle introduced herself and explained the purpose of her visit, because the face is part of the account. The specific sequence, confusion, then a rapid assessment, then the real estate agent's social composure coming up like a shield, then, and this is the part I had not predicted exactly, a specific fear, not guilt initially, fear. The fear of a person who has understood, suddenly and completely, that the situation they are in is significantly larger than they had thought. Danielle conducted the assessment with the thoroughness and the specific procedural care that APS assessments require. She spoke with me separately for approximately 40 minutes. She spoke with Gregory separately for approximately 30 minutes. She spoke with Renee separately for approximately 45 minutes. She examined the current contents of the refrigerator, for which I had not prepared anything. I had photographed it that morning after photographing the bread, and the documentation was already in the file. The refrigerator contained the bread, still on its plate on the counter where I had left it. 3 containers whose label dates I had recorded and whose contents I had noted, and a container of milk that was 4 days past its sell-by date, which in a household with children was a separate concern. Danielle photographed the refrigerator contents. She photographed the bread on the counter. She made her own notes. After the assessment, she told both Gregory and Renee that she would be completing a formal report and that the case would be assigned to a specialist for follow-up. She explained that based on the documentation and the current evidence, and the case met the threshold for formal investigation under the elder neglect statutes. She gave Gregory a resource packet. She gave me her card. Before she left, she said to me, quietly, in the hallway, while Gregory was in the kitchen, "Your documentation was exceptional. That kind of documentation makes a significant difference in these cases." I thanked her. I told her it was what I had been trained to do. She nodded. She said, "I know. I looked you up." The children came home from school at 4. Gregory had decided, and I agreed with the decision, not to tell them what had happened until the situation was clearer. They knew something was different. Marcus, in particular, who had the specific sensitivity of a 12-year-old who has been watching adult dynamics very carefully for some time, looked between his parents and then at me with an expression that I recognized as him filing something for later consideration. Lily made me a drawing of flowers, which is what she does when she senses that the adults around her need something and doesn't know what else to offer. I accepted the drawing and told her it was exactly right. The evening was quiet in the specific way of evenings when something large has happened, and everyone in the house knows something large has happened, and no one is talking about the specific large thing because the children are present, and some conversations require the absence of children. Gregory made dinner. He is a competent cook who rarely cooks because Renee manages the household, and Renee's management of the household includes managing the kitchen And Gregory has accepted this division of the household labor in the specific way of people who have traded their preferences for the sake of the management. He made pasta, and he made enough for everyone, including me, and he served it with the careful attention of a man who is making a point without speaking. Renee did not make a point. She ate her pasta in the specific silence of someone who is doing the accounting and has not yet arrived at a conclusion. She looked at me twice, and both times I was looking at something else, or appeared to be. After the children went to bed, Gregory and Renee sat down with me in the living room. Gregory spoke first. He said, "I should have paid more attention. I should have seen what was happening. I didn't. And I'm sorry, Mom. What I should have done is made sure you were being treated the way you deserve to be treated. And I didn't do that. And I'm sorry." This was the most he had said to me about the situation, and it was more than I had expected him to say so quickly. I thanked him. Renee was less direct and more complicated, which is also accurate. She said, I didn't think about what it meant. I was busy, and I was thinking about convenience, and I wasn't thinking about... She stopped. Then, I want to say it wasn't intentional, but I know that doesn't make it better. No, I said, it doesn't. But it's a useful thing to understand, and I believe you. There was a silence. What happens now? Gregory said. I told him. The APS investigation would continue. The formal report would be filed. Depending on the investigation's findings, there could be additional consequences. I had not decided yet whether I would pursue civil remedies through Constance's office. I had decided that I would not be living in this house after tonight. I had called my sister Eleanor that morning. Eleanor lives 45 minutes from Marietta. We're in a house with a guest room and a garden, and a view of the Chattahoochee that I have always found genuinely restorative. She had said when I explained the situation that the guest room was mine for as long as I needed it, and that she would be there to help me move my things whenever I was ready. Eleanor is coming tomorrow morning, I said. I'll be moving my things to her house. This is not a permanent decision about where I live long term. It's a decision about where I live while the APS investigation proceeds and while I think clearly about what I want. Gregory looked like a man who had been expecting this and had not found a way to accept it in advance. Mom, he said. I know, I said. I love you. That's not the question. The APS investigation took 6 weeks. I was at Eleanor's house for all of it, in the specific restorative quiet of a space that was mine by invitation rather than negotiation, with Eleanor's garden to tend and her kitchen to use, and the Chattahoochee visible from the window in the mornings. I want to tell you what the investigation produced, because the investigation produced things that I had not anticipated, and that complicated the picture in ways that required adjustment. The caseworker assigned to the formal investigation was a supervisor named Raymond Chen, who had been with the Division of Aging Services for 16 years, and who brought to the investigation the specific expertise of someone who has done this work long enough to understand that situations are almost always more complex than the initial report suggests. And he was thorough. He interviewed Gregory and Renee multiple times. He interviewed Marcus separately and with appropriate protocol. He reviewed my documentation. What the investigation found, the documented pattern of food incidents, was real. and met the definition of elder neglect under Georgia statute. The specific incidents involving clearly spoiled food, including the bread, were the most significant. However, the investigation also found that Renee's behavior appeared to be more consistent with the specific neglect pattern of a person who had not consciously thought about the implications of what she was doing than with the deliberate abuse pattern of a person who intended harm. This distinction matters legally and practically. Elder neglect under Georgia law covers both intentional and negligent behavior, but the legal consequence and the remedial responses differ depending on the finding. Raymond Chen's formal report concluded that the case met the threshold for a finding of neglect, which would be recorded in the APS system and could affect Renee's background check for certain employment categories. The case did not meet the threshold for criminal elder abuse charges, which requires evidence of willfulness or recklessness that the investigation did not find clearly supported. I accepted this finding, not easily. There were mornings at Eleanor's house when I thought about the 47 entries and the steak and the avocado toast and the bread, and the acceptance was not simple. But I have worked in regulatory and enforcement settings long enough to understand that the finding that matches the evidence is the correct finding, regardless of whether it is the finding I would prefer. I want to say something about the nights at Eleanor's house during the 6 weeks of the investigation, because those nights are part of the account. I had my own room, with a window overlooking the garden and the distant sound of the Chattahoochee. Eleanor brought me tea in the evening without being asked, the way that people who know you well bring you what you need without requiring you to name it. She is 5 years older than me and has spent her life being the person who brings the tea, and she is very good at it. I tended her garden. I went to bed at reasonable hours and woke at 5, which is what I have done for 30 years. And I made my own breakfast from fresh food that I had purchased myself from a grocery store 2 streets away. And the making of breakfast from food that was demonstrably fresh and appropriate, the specific sensory experience of it, the smell of good bread toasting, the color and texture of good eggs, was, I found, more restorative than I had anticipated. I had not realized how much of my attention had been going over 6 months toward the management of the food situation, the assessment of whether what was in front of me was safe, the decision about whether to eat it or find an alternative, the note-taking. This management had been continuous and had cost something that I only noticed in its absence. The ordinary relaxed quality of a person who does not have to think about what they are eating, because what they are eating is simply food. At Eleanor's house, the food was simply food. I ate it without assessment. And the restoration this produced was not dramatic. It was the specific quiet relief of a return to ordinary. Raymond Chen called me 4 times during the investigation, each time to clarify a specific documentation entry, to ask a procedural question, or to request an additional piece of evidence. Each call was professional and specific. He was, I thought, a person who took the work seriously, which is what the work requires. At the end of the investigation, he called to inform me of the finding and to explain what would happen next. He was thorough and clear. Before he ended the call, he said, "Mrs. Beaumont, in 16 years, I have reviewed a lot of APS intake documentation. Yours was the most complete and professionally presented I have seen from a private individual. The outcome of this case is in part a function of how well you documented what happened. I thanked him. I told him I was glad the training had been useful. He said, "Me too." Constance reviewed the investigation report and advised me on civil options. I had a valid negligence claim with compensable damages. I chose not to pursue it. The APS finding was the accountability that the situation required. The civil case would have produced money and more conflict, and I did not need the money and did not want more conflict. What I wanted was for Renee to understand what she had done, and for Gregory to be present for the understanding, and for the understanding to be real rather than strategic. Whether that happened is the question I have been sitting with. Gregory drove to Eleanor's house 3 weeks after I moved in, on a Sunday afternoon, alone. He called ahead to ask if he could come, which told me that the visit was deliberate rather than impulsive. Deliberate visits are prepared, and preparation told me that he had been thinking about what he wanted to say. We sat in Eleanor's garden, because the garden is the right place for difficult conversations. It does not create the compressed intimacy of a small room, or the diffuseness of a large one, and the presence of growing things is steadying in a way that indoor spaces are not. He was visibly a man who had been through something, the specific quality of someone who has been confronted with a version of their life that they have been managing not to see, and who has spent 3 weeks looking at it. And he said, "I want to understand what happened, not defend it, understand it." "All right," I said. "I knew things weren't right," he said. "I noticed when you weren't eating with us sometimes. I noticed that you were always offered things that were..." I told myself it was the logistics of the household, that Renee was managing a lot, and that things sometimes fell through the cracks. I told myself it wasn't intentional. "Was it intentional?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Renee says it wasn't. Raymond Chen's report says it wasn't. I think she didn't think about what it meant. I think she thought of you as someone who could manage, who didn't need the same things, who would figure it out. I think she didn't think about whether what she was offering you was actually adequate, because she didn't think about you the way she thought about herself. The way people don't think about the people they consider less important than themselves," I said. He looked at me. "Yes, that's neglect," I said. "Not criminal intent, but neglect. The APS finding is accurate." "I know," he said. "And your part," I said, "is that you saw it and told yourself a story about it that allowed you to continue without addressing it, which is also a form of neglect, Gregory, though not one that the APS statute covers." He was quiet for a long time. The garden was quiet in the specific way of a Sunday afternoon garden. Birds, a slight wind, the sound of Eleanor's neighbor's lawnmower somewhere down the block. "What do you want?" he said. "From me?" "And from the situation. I want you to have the full conversation with Renee that you've been avoiding," I said. "Not about the APS report, about what it means for a person to live in your household and be treated as less than the other people who live there. I want that conversation to have happened, and I want it to have been honest, because you two are going to be married for a long time, and the way Renee treated me is a version of the way she thinks about people who are less powerful than her in any given context. And that is information that your marriage needs to have properly processed." He nodded. He did not say the conversation had already happened. He said, "I'll have it." "Good," I said. I want to talk about food, because the account is about food in a specific way that goes beyond the regulatory dimension, and the specific way deserves to be named. In 31 years of food safety inspection, I have been in thousands of kitchens, restaurant kitchens, institutional kitchens, school cafeteria kitchens, the kitchens of residential care facilities, and summer camps, and hospital food service operations. I have seen the full range of what happens in those kitchens, the brilliant and the adequate and the negligent and the deliberately unsafe. I have cited, suspended, and closed operations across that full range. What I have come to understand through 31 years of looking at how food is prepared and who it is prepared for is that food is not simply nutrition. Food is care. The way you prepare food for someone is an expression of how you regard them. The attention you bring to what is safe and what is fresh and what is appropriate is a direct expression of whether the person eating it matters to you. This is not a sentimental observation. It is a regulatory reality. The entire framework of food safety law is built on the premise that the people who eat the food have a right to food that is safe, and that the people who prepare and serve the food have an obligation to ensure that it is. The obligation exists because the right exists, and the right exists because the people eating are people, and people matter. When Renee offered me moldy bread while she ate fresh sourdough toast, she was expressing, in the specific language of food, the way she regarded me relative to herself. The expression was not verbal, and it was more honest than verbal. It was behavioral. She had made a choice about what each of us deserved to eat, and the choice reflected her assessment of what each of us was worth. I do not think she understood this. I do not think she had articulated it to herself in these terms. But the behavior is the data, and the data is clear. And my 31 years of reading food safety data means that I am good at reading behavior that is expressed through food. A single incident of offering someone inadequate food can be an oversight. A pattern of 47 incidents over 6 months is a statement. The statement Renee was making, whether she knew she was making it or not, was, "You do not matter the way I matter. Your needs are less important than my convenience. The food I give you is the food I give someone who is functionally less than fully present in the household I am managing." This is elder neglect. It is also, in a broader sense, the specific form of disregard that is most harmful to people who are dependent on others for their care. Not the dramatic cruelty of deliberate harm, but the quiet, continuous disregard of people who have simply not considered that the person in their care has the same claim on the household's attention and resources as everyone else. The bread was evidence. The bread was also a statement. The bread was, in the most literal sense available, the expression of a set of values that needed to be confronted. I confronted it. The kitchens I closed over 31 years were not always the kitchens of people who intended harm. More often, they were kitchens of people who had stopped paying attention. And the residents in care facilities rarely complained about inadequate food because they did not want to be difficult, because complaining would make the people who controlled their food supply less happy with them, and they depended on those people. The silence enables the neglect. The neglect deepens the silence. I was not going to be silent. Not because I lacked the understanding of the vulnerability. I understood it precisely, having studied it for 31 years. but because silence was not the right response, and I have never been a person who chooses the easy, wrong response over the difficult, right one. Bernard used to say I was constitutionally incapable of looking away from something I had seen. He meant it affectionately. He was right. I am at Eleanor's house as I write this. It is September, which means I have been here 3 months, and the Chattahoochee is running at its late summer level, lower than spring, the rocks visible at the edges, the water clear and cold from the mountains. Eleanor's garden is doing well. I have been tending it with the attention it deserves. The APS finding is in the record. Renee attended the mandatory family meeting that the APS process requires, which was facilitated by Raymond Chen, and which was, by all accounts, a thorough and difficult conversation. I was not present for it. I did not need to be present for it. The process does not require my presence, and my absence from the meeting was not avoidance. It was the correct acknowledgement that some conversations are between the people who had them. And my role in the process was to initiate it and provide the documentation, not to oversee its conclusion. Gregory and I talk every Sunday. The conversations have a different quality from the conversations we had before the move, more honest, less managed. He has told me in pieces over 3 weeks of Sunday calls about the conversation with Renee that I asked him to have. It was difficult. It produced some things. He is not certain whether it produced everything it needed to, and he said this to me directly, which is itself a sign that the conversations are more honest than they used to be. I am thinking about where to live next. Not here permanently, though Eleanor would have me for as long as I wanted. My own house is the most honest answer. I sold my house in Augusta when I moved to Marietta, which was a mistake in retrospect, though not one I could have known for certain was a mistake at the time. I am looking at properties in the Augusta area where I know people and where the specific quality of the place suits me. Eleanor is supportive. Gregory is supportive, with the specific support of a person who feels guilty and is trying to convert the guilt into practical assistance. Constance advises me that the civil case remains open for another 18 months before the statute of limitations runs. I have not decided. What I want to say about dignity is this. Dignity is not self-presentation. It is not the way you hold yourself or the way you dress or the way you speak in difficult situations. Dignity is the knowledge of what you are worth, held internally, applied consistently in the specific daily choices of how you respond to the way others treat you. And I knew what I was worth when Renee put the bread on the table. I knew it when she made the avocado toast with the fresh sourdough. I knew it in every one of the 47 incidents over 6 months. Knowing it is what allowed me to document the incidents rather than absorb them, to treat each incident as data rather than as a verdict on my value, to understand that the statement Renee was making with the food was a statement about herself and not a statement about me. The bread told me who she was. It did not tell me who I am. I am Adele Rose Fontaine Beaumont. I spent 31 years ensuring that the people who ate in commercial and institutional settings had access to food that was safe and adequate and appropriate, because I believed and believe that what you eat is an expression of whether someone cares about you, and that everyone deserves to have someone care about them, and that when no one is caring, the regulatory and legal systems exist to require it. I cared about my own case with the same professional attention I brought to every case. The moldy bread is in evidence. The 47 documentation entries are in the APS file. The investigation is complete. A single bite of food can be evidence of a lifetime of disregard. I chose not to take that bite. I chose instead to photograph it. I want to say something about what happened to the training curriculum I mentioned at the beginning of this account. The curriculum I wrote for the state of Georgia, the food safety training program used in all licensed care facilities. I wrote it in 2009. After a case I investigated in which a resident of a licensed care facility had become seriously ill from food that had been held at unsafe temperatures for an extended period. The resident survived. The facility was cited. The training program was a response to that case. The specific response of someone who understands that the correct answer to a systemic failure is a systemic remedy. Module 3 of the curriculum is titled Recognizing the Relationship Between Food Safety and Dignity. I wrote that title. I wrote the module. The module opens with this statement. The person who prepares and serves food for someone who cannot fully prepare and serve their own food holds a specific position of trust. That person has made, through their role, an implicit commitment to the welfare of the person they are feeding. Violations of food safety standards in care contexts are not only regulatory failures, they are failures of that implicit commitment. I did not write that module thinking about myself. I wrote it thinking about the residents I had encountered in care facilities across Georgia, the women and men who ate what was put in front of them and who trusted that what was put in front of them was adequate because the alternative, not trusting, was too difficult to sustain. 31 years after writing that module, I was living in my son's house and being offered moldy bread. The situation is not the same as a licensed care facility. I am not a resident requiring full-time care. I am a 67-year-old woman with complete functional independence who had moved into a household where a specific kind of disregard was operating. And the regulatory framework does not apply in exactly the same way. But the principle applies exactly. The person who has been offered food in a dependent relationship has a right to food that reflects their full humanity. And when that right is violated through inattention or disregard, the violation is a moral failure before it is a legal one. I have been thinking about writing a revised introduction to Module 3, something that names the domestic context explicitly, that addresses the specific vulnerability of elderly people who move into family households after the death of a spouse, who are in the position of depending on people who love them, but who may not have thought carefully about what that dependence requires. The legal framework for domestic elder neglect is less developed than the framework for institutional care. Again, the gap matters. I have not decided yet, but I am thinking about it. Eleanor has been encouraging me to write more generally. She says I have 31 years of observations that deserve to be somewhere other than a memo application. She may be right. She is often right about things that I resist initially and accept later, which is the specific pattern of a relationship between two people who know each other well enough to know which of them is more likely to be right about what. The properties I have been looking at in Augusta are mostly in the neighborhood where Bernard and I raised Gregory, which surprises me. I had thought I would want to be somewhere different. somewhere that did not carry the specific weight of a shared life that is now half empty. I have found instead that the weight is not a burden. It is a record. And the neighborhood knows who I was when I lived there with Bernard and who I became over 43 years in the life we built together. I do not want to start somewhere new. I want to continue somewhere real. I found a house on a corner lot with a garden that has been neglected for 2 years by owners who moved away before they found a buyer. The garden is recoverable. I have walked through it twice and assessed what would need to be done, which is the specific assessment of a person who has spent her life looking at what things require and determining whether the requirement can be met. It can be met. I am going to make an offer. A single bite of food can be evidence of a lifetime of disregard. I chose not to take that bite. I chose instead to photograph it. And then I chose to document it and to report it, and then to move to my sister's house and to tend her garden, and to talk to Gregory every Sunday, and to look at houses with neglected gardens on corner lots, and to think about revising a training curriculum, and to write this account. I am Adele Rose Fontaine Beaumont. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years ensuring that the people who ate in commercial and institutional settings had access to food that was safe and adequate and appropriate. I am still doing that work in a different form, in a different setting. The work does not end when the title does. Bernard would have found this entire situation characteristic. He would have said, "Of course you documented it. Of course you called Constance an APS before you called me." And he would have said this with the specific warm exasperation that he brought to the occasions when I handled things in the way I handle things, methodically and without apology for the method. He would have been right, and he would have also said that he was glad I was all right, and he would have said it first before anything else, because that was who he was. I miss him. This is not a new observation, but I am writing this account in a room with a window that overlooks a garden and a river, and the specific morning light of the south in September is coming through the window, and I am going to have breakfast made from food I chose and prepared myself, and the breakfast is going to be entirely safe to eat. This is not nothing. This is, in the most ordinary and most important sense, exactly what everyone in every household deserves. Marcus called me last week, not through Gregory. Marcus, 12 years old, who used a friend's landline because he does not yet have his own phone. He said, "Grammy, I'm glad you're okay." I told him I was glad too. He said, "I'm sorry about what happened." I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. He said, "I know, I just wanted to say it anyway." I told him that was a good instinct and that he should keep it. He is going to be fine. He is going to be a person who says sorry when he wants to, even if he doesn't have to, and who pays attention to the people around him, and who notices things and chooses carefully what to do with what he notices. These are the qualities that matter most. Lily drew me a picture of the Chattahoochee from her father's description. It showed a wide river with rocks at the edges and a garden along one bank, and what appeared to be a large, extremely contented fish in the middle. I have put the drawing on the windowsill where I can see it in the morning.